Welcome to Syntax on this. What? What's going on?
No, I'm trying to be animated because of it's going to be on video now. Although, should we do a little bit of faces first?
Yeah. Let's just leave all of this in, okay? Welcome to Syntax, and this is episode number 723. We're going to be talking all about Svelte 5, what you need to know, what's important, what the big picture stuff is, and what it's all about. And you know what? Welcome, everybody. This is officially the first video episode of Syntax. Now, you may have seen some prior episodes being popped up. We decided to just take some of our best episodes of the past couple of months and just throw them up. And those weren't actually recorded as being a quote-unquote video podcast. So this is going to be the format going forward here, and you may see some tweaks along the way. And what we're going to be doing here, don't fret for all you audio listeners out there, not much is going to change for you. We're not going to be describing things that you're seeing on screen. Perhaps in the future, if we are talking about code, we'll be showing some code, but we're not going to speak about it any differently than we are currently. So, welcome, Wes. How's it going?
Going good. Pretty stoked to be here. I've been fussing with my mic and everything. Have we even, should we introduce Randy or what episode do we introduce Randy?
Maybe we should introduce him on the potluck episode. Since This is a hasty, Randy, you're just going to have to sit in the shadows for one more episode, and then we can introduce you into the next one. That makes more sense, I think. And likewise, if you're introducing any code into your application, which, you're doing all the time, you're probably going to want to make sure that you have error and exception handling tracking because, hey, if you introduce anything, you could break your code. You know what breaks code? Writing code. And if you write code at all, well, you have an opportunity to have a bug slip in there. And more than just bug tracking, I think this goes right along with some of the messages of Svelte 5. You want to be tracking that speed and the size of your code base. And that's one of those things that Svelte 5 really nails. And Sentry can do all of that for you. You can see exactly, how fast your application is running and, what you're serving up to your users at any given point. So check it out at sentry.io/syntax and give it a try today. All right, Svelte 5. Wes, to give you some background here, I have been cranking on a real-world app. I've mentioned it a couple times on here. It's this habit tracking app. That part's not important. The important part is that I've been getting my hands real dirty with Svelte 5. I've been using just about as many of the APIs as I can in a real-world context. I've been finding the pain points. I've been really the experience. And then just yesterday, I got to talk with the Svelte 5 team a little bit about, the Svelte team a little bit about Svelte 5 and, where it's at and what's going to change. So I feel like I have some pretty good info here. Big picture here is that most of the APIs in Svelte 5 are finalized. Now, granted, there could be some new stuff specifically around animations, but for the most part, you can take a look at runes today in the previews or the docs and have a pretty good idea of what the end result will look like once this stuff is released. The big, in my mind, and this is not from the Svelte team, by the way, a lot of this is my thoughts, my impressions that Svelte 5 is about three things. It's about speed, simplicity, and size, which tracks that it's S. Svelte team, if you want to use the fact that Svelte 5 is speed, we could come up with two more S's if you want, and then you could have five things that start with S. A triangle, speed, simplicity, and size. And you'll see this pop up in a lot of ways throughout the course of this. Speed, it's very fast, very, very fast. Size, bundles are very, very small. We will talk more about that. And simplicity in these APIs, what it's doing is it's essentially taking out a lot of the places in Svelte where it felt like there may have been one or more ways to do things and really nail it down to here's the way in which you do things now, which is great in terms of simplicity.
Yeah. All right, let's hear it. I want to know what all these features are because we've got the Syntax site, and I'm sure I would love to implement some of our new features with these things. So it's it's released, like, right, like, are we able to update our site to Svelte 5? I know we updated to Svelte Kit 2 just a couple days ago.
This is not released. It's still in beta. It may even be alpha. No, it's in the next flag. It's under the next flag. Okay. Now, I suspect a release candidate is coming sometime in the next month and a half. You know, I would imagine that you're going to get to release candidate phase here shortly. So that's good news for anybody who's looking to adopt this stuff. That said, I'm running an app in production with this stuff right now using the next version of it, and that's not a smart idea. But if you're like me, sometimes you forego smart ideas to do fun ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So what are runes? Tell me. I'm dying to know here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a rune kind of refers to the idea that in Svelte, you know how we occasionally had like some weird magic symbols in Svelte? You had the $sign to indicate reactivity, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you did double $signs to get rest props. Well, runes kind of like takes that idea and defines like, all right, we have the $sign, and that's going to be considered like the magic symbol. It's the rune, right? It's the symbol that indicates, hey, there's something interesting going on here. And it really tackles a couple of big areas. One, state. In Svelte before, you could do state by just having a variable, or you had a writable or a readable. You had lots of ways of doing state. In Svelte 5, state is being done through the $state rune. You create a state, and then you can update it reactively within a component. You can create bigger, better global stores outside of components and have them use the exact same APIs, which was one of the problems before with Svelte, was that if you're pulling state outside of your component, now you're using different APIs than if you're working with state locally in a component.
Yeah, that was always a bit funky.
And another thing is that like big custom stores become way easier to reason about and work in. So like you'll know that we have a big old custom store for our audio player, which many of you have noticed occasionally causes annoying bugs here and there. And many of that stuff is like when I'm working in Svelte 5, I'm thinking, man, that player code's going to be great to refactor. It's going to feel awesome to use using this new state rune. They're based on signals, which is something that you don't have to worry about. They're under the hood.
Oh, that's actually kind of nice. You don't have to really know what a signal is. You still have to know what a variable is, right? Like we're not moving to set state, right? We're still using mutable variables. So if I make a state and it's an array, I can still use push and slice and all my mutating values just fine, and it's reactive variables?
Correct. Yes.
Awesome.
And that's really the benefit of this stuff is when people ask me very frequently, hey, it looks kind of like React. And I think it does not feel like React because, one, you still get that variable mutating reactivity. You get like fine-grained reactivity in like, let's say you have an object full of a bunch of props. You can go in and reactively update just like one of those values, right? And because it is signals-based, you end up getting a lot of benefits overall in terms of this fine-grained reactivity. But in reality, again, it functions one way, and once you get used to it, it's very, very nice in many ways. You also have this derived rune where you can essentially track a rune to have a derived value. Let's say you have a state value that's 2. You have a derived value that's your state times 2. Yeah. That derive will always be in sync with the state value. If you update that state value, derive will update as well. That's a really nice way of doing things, I think.
We have that on a couple spots on the Syntax website where we take our state and then I need to like derive some values, right? Like I think in some spots, I think we filter an array depending on the values. And it was always a little bit funky where you had to like sometimes wrap, like do the $: and then wrap a whole block inside of that, and then reach outside and update another state variable. This derived is really nice because you can say like, okay, like it's not a new piece of state, but you should be watching internally what your pieces of state are doing. And I actually went through not the Svelte state signals, but I went through the Preact signals. So if you are ever want to read a fantastic, I don't know, it's probably 800 lines of code or 500 lines of code, go look at the preact signals. It's not our only React thing. It can be used with vanilla JavaScript. And it's a single file for the entire library. And how they detect whether variables inside of a derived function are changed is really interesting. It's essentially just watching for variables that change, and then it says, oh, something inside of me changed. I must then update my derived value.
Yeah. In like Vue, they're called like computed variables. There's something that I think works really well. I've been using it quite a bit. A lot of the runes kind of videos that people have been showing about describing them show like situations where, when you console log something, your state can kind of get out of sync because of perhaps like it's in a closure, or you're doing some, you're just trying to understand what this variable is at any given time. And I personally don't always hit those, but when I do hit those issues, they are kind of confusing. Like, why is this value not what I'm expecting it to be? And I think a lot of what this state variable or state rune does, besides just giving you one way to do state, is it makes working with state more reliable and generally more flexible. There are some things where you have to do getters inside of like big old custom stores. That will be a learning experience for some folks. You cannot export a primitive state. So if you do export const variable that is a state and that state value is just a string, that will not be reactive. So you have to throw that into an object or a custom store. That's something you could do with writables that you can't do anymore. But again, these are going to be small learning experiences that people are going to get past. And there's most likely going to be errors in your VS Code that says, hey, don't do that, do this instead. Next is $props. And this is the new way of doing props.
Sorry, I just looked at the example before you even explained it, and I was like, if you go back to the first episode on Svelte, I could not understand the export thing of the Svelte component. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and you're right. And not only were you like the type of person who'd be like, I don't get this export const props, which is how you did a props before. And you had to do each prop individually. This $prop solves so many issues around props being weird in Svelte. Basically, you say let, and then you destructure your values out of an object equals props. The reason why this rules is that, one, you can do all of the types for all of your props at once. You don't have to type each prop individually. So you can pass types in. That solves a lot of issues. Two, rest props in Svelte were weird before. If you wanted to get the rest of the props that maybe weren't exported, you did this $$ props. Now you just use the spread operator like you would in normal JavaScript. That greatly simplifies it.
That's going to be really handy for, like, if you have like a presentational component and then you have like the actual like component that does your functionality. Often you find yourself passing hot potatoing it just from the presentational component down to the functional component, and you're rewriting it many times. I found that really frustrating to do, and this will allow you just to spread them all down. That's something we have been able to do in React for a long time. Will, I have a question. You might not know the answer to this. Is that is class going to be involved in those props? That's one thing that always drove me crazy. Is you can't pass a class from a custom component down to the div unless you name it something like class with a Z.
Oh, man. That is not something I know, but I can actually test really, really quickly here.
I'll explain why I want this. So often I'll build a custom component in Svelte, and I want to slap a class on it because I want to style it in a certain way. And you're kind of crossing the like style boundary there where you specify the class. That's sort of done in like, maybe that's done in your page layout, and your page styles will be applied there. And then you go inside of your component, and any styles that you write inside of that component will then be applied. And I guess Svelte doesn't know that you used a specific class and it's being passed in. But I do find that really frustrating because I often just want to, I'm using this component, but it's like a different version of it. And you find yourself just like re-implementing the whole class structure. Like you make a prop called isBig or card layout or something like that. And it's just like, classes do this already.
Yeah. So in the preview, I am getting unexpected keyword class when I try to do that. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's the way it will be. That's a great thing that I think we should ping the Svelte team about, because when I was talking to them yesterday, they wanted to know about all these little weird things that you could think of.
Yeah.
And that's a good one.
I don't think you actually are able to destructure the word class, because class is a reserved word. And that's why React has class name, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
But if you destructure it with a rest, like you collect them all with ... it's probably not in there. Hey,
let me actually try that,
because it's not a prop; it's a HTML attribute. I don't know how they would be able to do they tree shake your CSS. So in Svelte, if you have a class that is not used in a component and it has a bunch of CSS associated with it, Svelte it just throws that CSS out, right? It's unused, and it has to be statically analyzed. So if the class is written in a different file, I don't know how they would figure that out. And maybe I'm just not doing it right, but I always found that to be a bit of a pain.
So I'm able to pass class as a prop with rest, and that seems to work if you use the rest, but you cannot destructure class.
Oh, but it is collected in the rest?
It is collected in the rest. And I was able to even output it into a template. I can make this available to anybody who wants to. I'm just working in the Svelte REPL here. So interesting enough. Next one is going to be the effect, which I think this is the rune effect that people look at this and they say, it kind of feels like React, doesn't it? And I'm here to say it does not feel like React, because I think the things that feel yucky about the React are the dependency array and maybe not necessarily knowing what's going to set it off. With Svelte, effect essentially just replaces the $ block syntax, and that is a good thing in my mind because it's way more predictable. Another cool thing about the effect is that it's removed entirely from server-side rendered code, so your server-side bundle is smaller, which is great. Svelte can be smart enough to say, hey, we know this is only going to run on a side effect. When something else happens, you can run. So what that means, Wes, is since it's removed from your server-side code, you could throw like a document dot whatever inside of there.
Or an entire client-side library.
Or an entire client-side library. In their demo, they were doing like a canvas style thing. And the reason why that rules is because if you've ever worked in React in a server-side rendered context, you'll know that you can't use effect. You have to use isomorphic effect for server-side content, or if you try to throw a document anywhere in a React component like that, it's going to complain, unless of course you're doing these new client-side components.
Yeah. Someone might be asking, who cares about how big your server-side functions are? Your bundles are on the server side, right? Doesn't really matter, does it?
No.
And the answer is, it actually does matter. Now that we're going a lot more to serverless and edge functions, the smaller they are, the faster they will be parsed and sort of boot up. And also, there's a hard limit to how much code you can put in a serverless function, edge function, and you do end up butting up against them. Especially sometimes you have these little libraries where you don't expect them to be huge. And in the next potluck, we have a question exactly on that, as to things that accidentally don't get tree shooken can actually really bloat your end bundle.
Yeah. So the cool thing about effect here is, again, it functions kind of like the React use effect, in which it runs when something has changed. Now, what does it run? When does it run? It's not about component re-renders in Svelte. We're not thinking about a function recalling itself like you do in React. You're thinking more or less, is the stuff that's used inside of here need to be updated, or when something happens, when something changes that's referenced inside of that effect will need to rerun. And so that's it. You don't have to worry about infinite loops. You don't have to worry about dependency arrays. Another really neat rune here is the inspect rune. And actually, I'm sorry, before we get off effect, you can actually do nested effects too, which is kind of blowing my mind right now.
Okay.
And I haven't. Yeah. So in Rich's example, he showed like both the initialization script as well as like the listening script for a canvas drawing app.
So an effect would probably be handy if you were watching, like, let's say you have a name variable and somebody types into a text box and changes their name. You might want to write an effect that then updates that value in the database whenever they type on it. Is that maybe an example of when you'd use an effect?
Maybe. Yeah. I'm going to tell you what. Effect pretty much replaces any time you would think about doing $:: a block.
Okay. Just when this code variables change. So it's not derived. Like you're not figuring out new state.
Correct. In fact, that's a thing they want you to know is that like if you're thinking about changing state, when some state changes, doing something when some state changes, you probably want to use derived, right?
Kind of like an add event listener for a piece of state when you want to have a side effect. You want to send some data elsewhere. You want to log something, or maybe not even log. We'll talk about the next one.
Yeah,
but it makes sense.
And one of the ways that Svelte's different from React is that you're more frequently working with the DOM itself, and so I think use effect is going to be particularly useful when working with the DOM itself. Next is inspect, which is kind of like console log, but you'll know that because unlike React, Svelte isn't just a function that runs. Console log would only run once unless you did the $: console log, which was obnoxious, but it made sense. Now we have this inspect rune, which is actually way better than a console log because it gives you context. It says, oh, this was an updated event. So in your console, it'll say component or variable updated, or it'll just say updated, or init, based on what the event was that caused this thing to change. So it is essentially a reactive console log, but it gives you a lot of context, and there's like more freedom in here, where there's even a callback. You can throw in a debugger statement in there. If you're the type of person who loves to use the debugger, it works really, really well in that context as well.
Oh, I like that as well. That's, again, that's something I use quite a bit, is you throw a console log in like right before you render, and if you want it to rerun when the values change, because you want to see what the actual updated values look like, it seems like usually I would think like, oh yeah, just an effect and put a console log inside of there. But this is even one step further because I realize that's something that is super common.
Pretty cool. And that's, a lot of these things I think at first glance, you could say, maybe this feels like you're adding more complexity. But in the end, I think every single thing here adds to the simplicity of Svelte, because there now becomes one way of doing things. And that way is both good, very good, easy, and very, very fast. So, I love all of that. Next up is snippets. That can actually be the fourth S in the 5 S's that we were talking about. Speed, simplicity,
and what
size,
about Scott?
Snippets, and Scott. There we go.
Pentagram with Scott on the top.
Yes, I love that. I love that for me to be included in the Svelte 5 release. Snippets are basically inline components. This is something that I know Wes has been asking for a long time. People in React land love to have multiple components per file. Like maybe you're just breaking out a singular section of a component that gets looped around. You don't want to have to create a whole new file, a whole new component just to do that. The whole rigmarole of exporting and passing props. Now you have snippets, which are essentially you're defining a section of code that can be reused as a snippet, and then you call it like a function using the @render keyword. You do @render, the function, and you pass in your props. Small caveats here, you can only pass in one argument to this, which is fine, because if you need more arguments passed in, you just pass them in as an object. So not really anything crazy or different there. But yeah, I know.
It's getting there, but like, okay, so now I'm building components with multiple props, but then if I want multiple in a file, then I gotta move it from multiple props to this like weird object. It's not a weird object, it's just an object, but all right, I'll take it, because I certainly hated having to put things in a separate file when it's, especially with an if-else, like you have the same component and you want to render it this way if this is the case, and this way if it's the case, and I need to render this in 2 spots. Now I have to put this whole thing in a separate file. So I'll take it.
I think in practice you'll like it.
Okay.
I've been using it pretty gratuitously throughout my app, and in fact, at one point I think I had like 4 snippets in one file, and it was really easy to reason about in that regard. I have since chilled out a little bit on the snippets and moved things into actual components as the application has grown. But I think that's a good indication of how you'll probably end up using this stuff, right? Because oftentimes when you are prototyping, you're just trying to throw something down, right? You're trying to throw it down, get it working, and then maybe as the application grows and you see, oh wait, I actually need to use this component elsewhere, perhaps I will turn it into an actual component.
And I bet, I don't know if this is the case, I don't see it in the thing, but I bet you can infer the types from the props object. So you could just say like, you could use TypeScript's partial type of props. I bet that would work. So you're not like doing a whole bunch of typing. You could say like, all right, well, this function is taking a partial, or pick. You're picking these 2 props out of all the props that were passed in. So I don't think it'd be as bad as I'm thinking.
You're not going to have to individually type those props, as far as I know. That get passed into the And let me even double check that with my code base right now.
Right now, it's not possible to add types to snippets, and the parameters. This is something we hope to address before we ship Svelte 5.
Okay,
because you're essentially just making a function, right? So
it is a function.
You would have to type the function itself, right? Otherwise, you don't know what to pass it or what the type of the data is coming in.
Yeah, that tracks. Okay, cool. Another cool thing about snippets is they can be passed as props. So you could have like a wrapper component, and you could throw a snippet as a prop and then access that inside of the component itself. And the neat thing about this is it kind of replaces the need for slots, because past snippets are way more powerful than slots were. I think we still need to see some code examples about what that looks like, considering slots are used throughout SvelteKit and all sorts of stuff. So, who knows what that is, but slots will probably eventually be removed in favor of snippets.
Makes sense. I was just about to ask, can you export a snippet from a file? But if you're doing that, you probably should just make a component, right?
Yes,
okay.
Probably. Yeah. I know there becomes a whole thing there, right? Where at what point does it become a component? And if you look at my code base over time, you can see that most of my snippets did become components once I needed more out of them. Next up is events, and this can be the last, well, maybe not the last thing here. We can move it along though. Events is on:click was kind of a fancy Svelte syntax. It now just becomes the straight up on click. And that's the same with all events for Svelte components. They all just become the on whatever attribute that exists within the browser, right? So you're now getting to, again, align yourself with the browser. No more fancy naming special situations there.
I kind of like that, though. And
yeah, it like stood out or what?
Yeah, I kind of like the syntax of it. I never liked the fact that on-click was not camel cased.
Yeah, I know. I get
and
that too.
It's just like a on blah, 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 right?
Yeah,
especially if you have custom events.
And I just asked them about this. Yeah, this custom events.
I'm also seeing here the pipe to prevent default is gone forever.
Yeah, I know.
I love that.
Let me tell you. In my conversation with the Svelte team, that was like one of the things, because they mentioned it very clearly in the docs that the prevent default is gone. And I had to ask just because I wanted to like truly make sure that it was gone. The way they see it is that you can just do a wrapper function around it, and they might even export those from Svelte,
It seems like
it's not the same, but yeah.
All of these new features that they've been rolling out are just JavaScript, right? All of they're all JavaScript. And then now they're getting rid of the custom syntax, and they're getting rid of some of the magic. What's the Svelte 6 end game here?
The Svelte 6 end game, I think, is more of a focus on the simplicity, and it does feel like you're aligning with the way they're describing it. Is I think it's like magic, not magical, or something. I believe that was the saying.
Okay.
We're like, they want it to feel like magic, but they don't want it to feel unpredictable, And so a lot of this is like aligning with browser APIs. And you saw that with SvelteKit a little bit, right? Their usage of progressively enhancing forms. You're aligning with real HTML APIs. You're just enhancing them further. Last little bit here are 2 new built-in functions. There's a few built-in functions to Svelte, like tick is one that we've used before to, essentially get the next tick in Svelte. It can be useful in contexts in which you just want to wait a frame,
Yeah, like you want to put something at the end of the event loop. So I have a package that is incredibly popular called wait. That is essentially a promise that resolves after however many seconds you pass it in. And I use it all the time for just wait 0. And Scott says, hey, you don't need that. Svelte has it built in.
Yeah, and it's great. It's one of my favorite APIs. I use it all the time when I need it. But now there's 2 new ones called untrack and unstate. Unstate just removes reactivity from a state variable, something that if you wanted to like really dive into, maybe some perf there, you have something that you don't need to update, you can unstate it. And untrack, I think, is actually kind of interesting. You use it in an effect, but it removes something from being treated as a dependency. Because remember, in Svelte, you don't have to have the dependency array. But let's say your effect is running too often because something is updating inside of if you want to remove something, you use the untrack function. And it's interesting. It's kind of like a reverse dependency array, right?
Oh, so.
But only if you want it.
Let me think about like how that might work. So you have an effect that is rerunning every single time the name changes. And we also need another variable inside of that effect. But that variable updates too often, right? So you say, okay, like you still pass the data in, but don't rerun me when when that variable changes. Only rerun me when the rest of the tracked values are.
Dead on.
That's nice. I could see that. I have a good example. Mouse X and mouse Y, right? Like you do need the mouse X and mouse Y, but don't rerun every single time someone moves the mouse, Totally. So pass it in, but don't rerun.
Yeah, those are nice little performance enhancing ones. And there's several things that I didn't mention, like state.frozen or effect.pre, effect.active, effect.root. There are nuanced topics here that you're not going to need to get into in 99% cases, because let me tell you, I built a whole app with user accounts and database, and I haven't had to use these once. So for the most part, these are things that only advanced users are going to want to dive into, and not stuff you're going to need to think about too much. So let's talk about the last benefits of this before I give my final thoughts. Smaller output. Here's a post from Reddit. I migrated 147 components, and my output is 55% smaller. So that seems like a pretty huge win. I think they just removed a lot of the stuff from Svelte.
Just got rid of it.
Just got rid of it, yeah. So that's one of the big things they wanted to emphasize, is that your code probably will be, well, not probably, it will be smaller if you use these new APIs, okay? And in the eventual situation, like who knows if this happens or not, but in the eventual situation where signals get added to the browser, you would then lose even that much more code from your end bundle, right? So that's something to think about. Speed, it's very, very fast. I've included the benchmarks here. The Svelte team did want me to let you know that like these benchmarks are, some people optimize their demos for these benchmarks, and therefore you should take all of these benchmarks with a grain of salt. But even taking them with a grain of salt, Svelte 5 version Next 35 is approaching native vanilla JS speeds all around. And compared to React or any of these other frameworks, it blows them out of the water. So it's shockingly fast. I'll say that.
Looking. What is faster on this benchmark than Svelte 5? So Solid is just beside it, above it. Vanilla JS, Million JS is really the only one that I've heard of on this list.
Right.
It's impressive.
It's impressive. It's super duper fast. And they wanted me to let you know that it's faster even than this kind of leads you on, because it's going to be faster in normal use cases that are not like benchmark specific use cases, right? Like in real world use cases, you're going to notice the speed. But they also said the framework shouldn't be the bottleneck ever. That's not going to be your bottleneck. It's going to be other things. So we're approaching a situation here with many frameworks, whether that is Solid or Svelte, where the framework is not the bottleneck. It's that fast. Suspected release, like I said, hopefully we're going to see an RC sometime before March. Could be around March. Who knows? Nothing official there. There will be a code mod of some kind as well to help you update. Who knows what that looks like, but it could probably be taking care of a lot of the easy stuff for you, like changing props to be the props rune. Who knows? My thoughts overall, this stuff kicks ass. I do like it a lot in usage. I think, there is maybe a little bit of a learning curve, but I found myself wishing that I was working in these Svelte APIs when I was working on some of the writable bugs that I was having. I feel like the state's way more predictable, easier to reason about. It does not feel like React, if that's your concern. The word effect does not make it React. There's a lot of really Svelte things about this overall. You can also try it today in the preview app. I'll have a link to that in the show notes if you want to just get your hands dirty with some of this yourself.
What about backwards compat with the older APIs? Is that stuff going to stick around, or is it going to be a big no, you got to move all your stuff over in one big go?
Almost nothing is removed from Svelte in Svelte 5. So there are situations where you become in runes mode where things don't work anymore. So it will allow you to migrate one component at a time. And again, hopefully with that code mod eases some of the pain if you have a lot of components that you're working with. But yeah, you can do incremental adoption. You could say, all my new components are going to use this stuff or whatever, or you can do it all in one fell swoop. I have found, again, most of this time I'm removing code. My code feels easier to write, and there's less foot guns, I think. There's less weird special circumstances.
Sweet. I think this looks very, very simple. It's I feel like I understand it, I've built a couple things in Svelte. Obviously built the syntax website in Svelte, and I feel like I know it pretty well, but this stuff seems very, very simple and very approachable. So I'm pretty stoked about it.
Yeah, I think when I first saw it, I was concerned. And then just like most things with the Svelte team, after spending some time with it, I really truly see their vision, and it all feels more simplistic in the end. I do have my code base that I'm working on too, if you want to see how I'm using this. Don't judge the code. A lot of this is scratchy stuff, but there's some real world examples. In mine, I have a global state store of dates and derived dates and getters and setters and more complex stuff. And so check it out.
Beautiful. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll catch you later.
Peace.
Peace.